Le balado Saumon Québec est une présentation de la Fédération québécoise pour le saumon atlantique. La meilleure façon de nous soutenir et de rendre nos projets possibles, c'est de devenir membre. Bonne écoute!
Bonjour tout le monde, ici Lyne Morissette. Bienvenue dans cet autre épisode du balado de Saumon Québec. Et c'est un épisode un peu spécial parce qu'on part faire le tour de la salmosphère. Donc, on va visiter un peu différents pays dans l'Atlantique Nord pour savoir c'est quoi la situation du saumon atlantique ailleurs que chez nous. Et on commence aujourd'hui avec les pays européens. Donc, je vous amène en France, en Grande-Bretagne, en Écosse, en Irlande. Et on va faire ça en anglais parce que notre intervenant, Ken Whelan, est à Dublin. Et puis, donc, petit avertissement, je vous dis bonjour en français. On fait le reste de la conversation en anglais. Et c'est un plaisir de le recevoir. Donc, on y va. On part à Dublin ensemble. And I'm here with Ken Whelan. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Hi, Lynn. Lovely to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for being with us as well. Just as an introduction, you have over 40 years experience in fisheries sciences, recreational fishery, climate change impact, Atlantic salmon and sea trout stock dynamics, and aquaculture. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. Correct.
Let me go on because you have quite a CV. You have participated in several research groups, including the Irish Marine Institute, the NASCO, the Salmon at Sea program, and the Atlantic Salmon Trust. And you are also adjunct professor in the School of Biology and Environmental Sciences at the University College Dublin. And you work as a consultant in the field of marine and freshwater fisheries.
Correct.
Yeah.
And also, in my spare time, then I like to go fishing. How boring can you get?
That kind of makes sense, though, eh? Thanks for being with us today. And we wanted to talk to you because we want to talk about the global situation of Atlantic salmon in the following, in the European countries like France, Great Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. So it's really a pleasure to be with you today. And in terms of context, just to tell our listener, in France right now, Atlantic salmon is classified as near threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. The problems facing the salmon are partly attributable to water quality, habitats, and the difficulty of surviving at sea. In the UK, the situation is not much better. The Atlantic salmon population is said to have fallen by 2/3 in 40 years. These figures are below the minimum needed to sustain the salmon populations over the long term. And according to these estimates, 90% of rivers with salmon populations are potentially at risk. River pollution is believed to be one of the main causes of this decline. And the overall situation for wild Atlantic salmon in Scotland is alarming. Populations are in steep decline, with returns of adult salmons to Scottish River reaching historically low levels. This decline is caused by a combination of factors. You'll probably tell us more about that, but we're thinking climate change, degradation of habitats, aquaculture-related parasites, pollutions, overfishing, and barriers to migration. So I think with you, we're going to be able to do a tour of European country and talk about that. But first of all, can you tell us a little bit about you and how you ended up being in a salmon expert in Dublin?
Yeah, I never called myself an expert. I think the Pope is the only person who's an expert because he's infallible. So I think I'm a salmon specialist. So I leave room for making mistakes. But I think really it all started in terms of my interest in fishing. And because of that, and because of a wonderful angling club here in Dublin, who in the 1960s had a very, very large juvenile contingent. And they used to bring us out and show us how to look after the rivers, as well as teaching us how to fish. So I got this incredible interest in insects and plants, everything that trout were eating. And I really couldn't think of anything else except rivers. And really, the rivers then drove me to a situation where I did zoology in the university. And I did my BSc thesis on trout, but then the opportunity came to do my PhD on mayflies. So I'm a little bit of a I suppose of a turncoat in the sense I turned from being an entomologist to being a fishery scientist then. But I was working away nicely on my insects, and I was also working on lots of coarse fish like pike and that. And at a very young age, just at 30 years of age, I got a phone call to say that my organization had become involved with salmon. And my boss and my boss's boss thought that salmon were quite boring, and really that most of the interesting research had been done, and asked me would I like to change jobs and start working on salmon. And I said, of course, why not? And the first thing that they asked me to do was to go around the world and make 2 movies about how salmon are managed across the North Atlantic. This is Atlantic salmon. We got an opportunity then to go to Canada, of course, to ASF. We got opportunities then to go to the US and see the Connecticut. We went to Canada. We went out to the Faroes. And it was an incredible introduction in terms of being able to see the breadth and scale of what was going on in the early 80s. And really, that's where my career in salmon started. And I've just been really, really lucky to get involved in all sorts of interesting projects. But probably the most important one, and we'll talk a bit about that today, was the Salmon at Sea program. Because until that time, really, we had done very little in terms of actually trying to understand what was happening at sea. And it's certainly my view that in terms of exactly what you were outlining earlier, the main driver are problems at sea. All of the other problems are obviously totally legit, but I can give you facts and figures on the marine side, which I think will make your hair stand on end, because it is quite worrying what's happening at sea. And a lot of the other pressures then are just making things worse. But that particular overview that you gave was very accurate, and that's exactly what we're facing into.
And when you started and you traveled across the Atlantic to share knowledge about salmon at the beginning, did you think there was a special situation that was quite different in Europe than in Eastern North Atlantic, North America, or at that time were we already facing the same challenges, or there were different situations in both sides?
We had a very simple view of life.
Yeah.
And everywhere we went, the big problem was overfishing. So the big high seas fisheries had started in the Faroes and in Greenland. We obviously had a major drift net fishery in Ireland. There was a drift net fishery in Canada. There was a big drift net fishery in Norway. And all of the focus was reduce the netting. If we could get rid of the netting, magically, the salmon would bounce back. And that indeed is why NASCO was actually set up. So NASCO was set up to deal with the international fisheries because legally it couldn't be dealt with at the time. So that was really what we saw in our film, was that we needed to come up with novel ways of actually trying to support our commercial fishermen. And we come back and we made a movie then based around salmon ranching, which was just taking place in Iceland. And we saw that as a possible support in terms of our commercial fishermen along the coast. But it was really after that, it was around 1990, I suppose, really, that we started to realize that there was more to this than the fishery, because when the fisheries were removed, we didn't see this magic bounce back. And certainly we started to see by 2000, we really started to see that things were getting quite serious and that there was a real trend toward marine survival beginning to dip.
And this was like 40 years ago. And how is it now, the situation of wild Atlantic salmon in these European countries? Are we facing new challenges, or it's still the same kind of challenges that you had when you started your career?
No, these are some of the challenges have actually disappeared because we've been very effective at our fisheries management. But some of the challenges outside of that are even more pressing than they used to be. Perhaps for the listeners, I might give a very simple couple of numbers so that I'll put it in context.
Sure.
Because we're really very lucky in Europe because we have several what we call index systems. So these are research stations that have been in place for decades, where all of the fish are counted in and out. No estimates, they're all counted. So for 20 years or more, I ran one of these important research stations on the west coast of Ireland. So since about 1970, every single fish has been manually counted in and out. So our estimates are very, very accurate. In fact, they're not estimates, they're results.
That's an incredible database that you have
there. It's amazing. Yeah. So From that, we are able to show very clearly that if you had smolts going to sea, the baby salmon going to sea in the 1980s and the 1990s, if you had 100 little baby salmon going out, you would confidently expect that somewhere between 12 and 20 adult salmon would come back. We now have a situation where when we see 100 baby salmon going out, we're very lucky to see 7 or 8. It's normally 5. And in many instances, particularly for the larger multi-sea winter fish, it's 1 or 2%. So we're only really seeing a fraction of the survival that we saw in the past. And then you add in all of the other problems that you so clearly outlined at the beginning, and the pressure on these stocks is absolutely and completely enormous at this stage.
Yeah, we have like a similar questions here because we try to understand what's happening at sea that make these salmons not come back. Do you have an idea of what's happening on your side?
Well, we've been working very hard on this, and the organization, as you mentioned, I'm involved with. I'm a vice president in the Atlantic Salmon Trust, and I organized with some colleagues a workshop in 2017 to see how would we go about this. And we actually created then what we've described as the likely suspects framework. So we decided we would pile in everybody's view. We take everyone into consideration. We wouldn't exclude anybody or any set of data. And we got fantastic support from scientists, not just in the Atlantic, but the Pacific as well. And we whittled down a very, very large number to a situation where we've identified about 8 or 9 that we think are the main candidates. And they are the candidates that now where we're investing our funding and seeing what is happening. But some recent publications very clearly show that the marine world is changing. I can only speak, of course, about about here in the Eastern Atlantic, but certainly the changes we see in the ocean are stunning. And we're very lucky in Ireland because of the fact that Ireland is obviously on the edge of Europe, and its seas divide the cold northern seas from the very warm southern seas. So we have a very interesting mix of sea species. But we have seen 2 or 3 completely novel sea species take up home in Ireland, and that's because of the warming water, we think.
Yeah.
So, for example, you might only think of triggerfish as a fish that you would see in the Caribbean when you were on your holidays. But the triggerfish appeared in southwest Ireland about 25 years ago.
Oh, really?
And this year, they actually moved up along our east coast because we've had a whole series of marine heat waves. So the extent of these changes in the ocean are reflected as well in the plankton. And some very interesting science has shown very clearly that the energy component of the plankton off the west coast of Ireland and Scotland now, in comparison to the 60s, is actually extremely low. So even when the fish are going to sea, they are facing all sorts of different changes, and they're facing into a very different ocean. So it's a very, from a scientific point of view, a fascinating problem, but certainly from a salmon conservation point of view, a really worrying problem.
Yeah, definitely. You are talking about like bringing everyone together. How challenging is that to work with scientists, fishermen, maybe people from the industry? Was it quite a mess, or it was kind of easy to handle all these different perspectives?
It's actually the modern technology we have now available to us makes it so much easier, because if you organize your meeting at the right time, you can have folks joining you from, Long Live the Kings. We're very involved with actually creating this likely suspects framework, and we had people from Alaska. So we have day-to-day contact with lots of different groups. I don't think we're stretching ourselves far enough as scientists in terms of engaging with communities. I think scientists in general, speaking against my profession, I don't think they're fantastic communicators. I think they definitely should be doing more podcasts. I think they should be explaining what they're doing and getting people excited about it. And I don't see that happening, and it's a pity, because it is very exciting, and I think there's a lot happening. I'm very encouraged. I do a lot of work with communities, teaching them how to look after their rivers and their lakes outside of my salmon work. And I know the feedback I get from those communities. And I think that has to be a huge aspect of how we handle things going into the future.
Yeah, well, I think it's unfortunate that it's not something that they teach us at school when we do biology or science in general, how to communicate our results to the general public. And when you're lucky enough to have some sort of skills in that, it's great, but it's not something we learn. But as you said, we need to connect more with the communities. At that time of climate change and perturbations to our ecosystems, we don't have the luxury to do without this knowledge or without these people. We need to communicate more. But yeah, definitely, it's not something we learn. We learn at school, and that's quite unfortunate. We need you talked about different perspectives on trying to learn more about the situation of salmon in your countries. We need to talk about the farming industry. Is it affecting the wild salmon population in your waters?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing, and this is something that you read out there in terms of my CV, I was very involved in from a professional point of view. So when I worked as a director in the Marine Institute, I had a very interesting challenge. I was director of research in terms of aquaculture, as well as being director of research in terms of wild salmon. So that was really very, very fruitful, because just by chance, some of the administrators at that time, their responsibilities involved both the wild fish and the farmed fish. So we had to make it work. It wasn't a situation where we could snipe at one another. We had to actually make it work.
Yeah.
Having said that, in the context of the aquaculture industry in Europe, the two really big aquaculture countries are Scotland and Norway. And certainly in those countries, there are very, very serious concerns. But the concerns are obviously confined to the areas where the aquaculture industry is actually located. In Ireland, we have a very tiny aquaculture industry. And interestingly, the science would indicate that our biggest problem has been with our sea-run brown trout, or sea trout. And they have been very badly affected by sea lice from the salmon farming industry, to such an extent that we've lost some of the populations. But we also have individual years where the salmon farming industry is making an impact on our wild fish. And certainly that's something that NASCO is struggling with, in terms of making sure that in those areas that the management systems are put in place to try and reduce the overall numbers of lice, and also, of course, to reduce escapes because of the genetic implications, and to reduce pollution in the bays. It's still a very big challenge, but in the overall context, we are still looking at much greater problems in the open ocean, I feel, than we are in terms of individual pressures. But that's not to undermine in any way the importance of aquaculture impacts.
Yeah, and I guess it's quite a challenge. Like, even though the salmons all have their specific rivers, and in a way, it's easier to manage them by country or by province in our side of the Atlantic. But like, you have quite a bunch of countries that are close to one another with different management measures. It must be a challenge to manage the wild Atlantic salmon between France, Great Britain, Scotland, Ireland. Do these countries work together or collaborate to promote conservation, or it's all separated?
Well, you must remember that until Brexit, everyone was involved in this particular club. So in the context of the European Union, the way the European Union works is that there is agreement in Parliament that certain directives then would be followed by the various countries. And directives in the EU countries, they're not diktats. They're basically agreements that certain challenges have to be met. And in that context, then each country makes its own legislation, but with the view to actually meeting that challenge. So some of the programs we have, probably the best one, is one called the Water Framework Directive. That's unbelievably good. And the Water Framework Directive is the one that actually controls the level of degradation in terms of pollution or water quality. In addition, we have an excellent one called the Habitats Directive. And under the Habitats Directive, salmon in particular benefit, because if you get a designation under the Habitats Directive of an SAC, a scientific area of conservation, you then list in that scientific area of conservation the species that are included. the ones that are actually identified as being important. And certainly in Ireland, and indeed the UK still follows this format, even though it's not part of the EU anymore. We're very lucky that salmon very often are a main species within that list in relation to the SACs, which gives communities and interest groups great power in terms of arguing for solutions really to any of the problems that we might be facing into. And for example, in the south of England, where there's a very, very big and very dense population, water quality has become absolutely huge because of the publicity that has surrounded it in recent years. And a lot of the water companies have been discharging very large quantities of sewage into the rivers, into very, very important rivers. And one singer, a chap called Fergal Sharkey, who's from Ireland, he has been to the fore in highlighting this. And the difference it's made in terms of public awareness is absolutely enormous. And I think, again, going back to communication, I think the fact that you can have people that can articulate a very clear story makes such a difference in getting people behind you in terms of your campaign, and having accurate information and not being over the top in terms of what you're looking for. They're the ingredients, I think, in terms of making achievements in those areas.
Yeah, and once a great idea is developed somewhere in one of these countries, is it easy to spread it around all over Europe, or it's like?
Yes, it's really simple, because like we have our own designated television channels. Euronews is watched and translated into all the different languages throughout Europe.
That's great.
So it's actually, it is a big plus. I'm not sure we use it to the full, but it is an enormous strength that, particularly in very, very much key issues like climate change, conservation in terms of designated species, water pollution, water quality, water availability, these are all common issues. And within the Parliament in Europe, then you have, a common agreement, lots and lots and lots of rows in Parliament. Every Parliament has lots of rows. That's very healthy. But eventually you get to the stage where you have an agreement, then you have a directive, and the directive goes to the various countries, and they basically say, over to you guys, here's the standard you have to meet, but your plan is your plan. We're not going to tell you how to do this, but by 2030 you have to have X, or by 2035 you have to have Y. And if you don't meet those targets, there are huge financial penalties.
And over the past years, what were your most inspiring or favorite conservation measures that you've seen in these countries? Which one was the most efficient spreading around all Europe?
I think probably moving away from fish, probably some of the reintroduction programs have been fantastic. So we have our white-tailed sea eagles back now. I was just looking at them the other weekend down in the southwest. And we get birds in from Norway, but they've taken to Ireland like ducks to water, no pun intended. And they're doing very well. And through the little wildlife program that I'm involved with, we on a regular basis get people phoning in that are really enthusiastic about this and see this as a fantastic step forward. And then we have a particular little freshwater mussel, which can live to 120 years of age, absolutely dependent on salmon and trout for part of its life cycle, these little pearl mussels. And again, the pearl mussel program tends to attract people because they understand that they can see these creatures in the water. They're very, very old, but if they're not reproducing, there will not be pearl mussel in 50 or 100 years' time. And it gives people a much better understanding of the timescales that biologists like myself have to think in. Very often in our world, we want immediate answers, but we can't make a salmon in any less than 5 years. If it's going to be a big 2-week sea winter salmon, it's going to take at least 5 years. The case of Canada, the case of Russia, some of those smolts are very, very old. It could be 12 years for a full cycle. And we can't increase the speed of that. So therefore, you're looking at decades for recovery. At the moment, what I'm trying to do is to get people to think about the problems we have with salmon as if it was a patient in hospital. So if you have a patient in hospital, what are the steps you take? Well, the first thing you do is you triage. And we have triaged for decades. So we have a very good idea as to what we need to fix. The second thing you do with the patient is to stabilize the patient. And I believe that's the stage we're at now. We're trying to stabilize this very steep decline. We then have to spend years actually doing the recovery piece. And when we've done the recovery piece, we can then think about allocation and fisheries. So we're 5 steps away from getting back to where we were in the 1980s. And yet people want artificial ways of trying to do this, and it's not possible.
Yeah.
And again, this is down to trying to explain to people that, I have 2 lovely little grandkids, and it's for Hugh and Sylvia. This is for that. It's not for me. It's not for my sons and daughters. It's for my grandchildren.
Yeah, and there's a discrepancy between like the decisions that are made on the political cycle, like every 4 years, for example, and the way we must connect to nature in cycles that are way longer than how we work right now. Like we are meeting generations, and the indigenous people in Quebec think and plan their use of resources over 7 generations. And I think it's way longer than the way the industry and our decisions and the politics work right now. And we need to kind of adapt that way of thinking and managing our resources.
Yeah, I'm such a fan of that approach. And just about 6 months ago, I was involved in a fantastic conference looking at the cultural significance of fish. So I gave a paper, obviously, on salmon, but some of our friends from New Zealand gave the most amazing paper on these fish that they call tuna, which are the long-finned eels that they have in New Zealand. And the Maori people, they are so connected to these particular eels and a lot of their myths and a lot of their stories, a lot of their culture. And they have to think long-term. And then we had some wonderful advocates then from First Nations, from Canada, and from the West Coast of the US as well. And again, I think we have to rethink the way we approach this.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all numbers. We have to try and think about how we do this over time. And if we can bring all of those communities on board, we have such a breadth of advocates that can assist us. And I always say, we have to look at it in terms of an ecosystem. I think to some extent there's big disadvantages in being called a salmon specialist, because I would like to think that because of the breadth of the different areas I've been involved in, I see it in a much wider context than just the fish alone. It has to be the ecosystem that we're trying to tackle. And certainly with us, some of the changes we're seeing in terms of climate change, because it's hitting us very hard, the changes we're seeing are really quite shocking. And some of the projects I've been involved with our big, beautiful limestone lakes, we're seeing massive changes there that are definitely related to climate change. And they're not changes that are being mediated by man, they're being mediated by the climate. And again, because we have so many individual specialists, I think to some extent they're not actually seeing the full lake. They're seeing their aspect of the full lake. And I think that's another area that I think we need to look again and see how we can encompass this sort of approach, because it's done very well in the marine world, but very poorly, I think, in the freshwater world.
Oh, yeah, maybe less. Yeah, because at the end, salmon is just an excuse, or even better than that, it's an opportunity to protect way more than just one species. If it can connect people for something, but then spread through all the ecosystem, then we have something that's relevant and powerful. Salmon by itself is important, but it's just part of the overall challenge.
Well, that was my little presentation at the conference. That's what I was trying to do, was explain to people that through the Irish language in particular, we can stretch back our knowledge of salmon to 5,000-6,000 years, when the first farmers came to Northwest Mayo. And when those farmers arrived at that time, just by chance, they arrived near to 2 of the most productive salmon rivers in the world. So from the very start, these big silvery migratory fish were included in our folklore. They were included in all of our stories. They were included in the way people lived and the seasonality in terms of how they lived. So these are things we have to rediscover and understand the significance of that and how sensible they were in terms of their management of these particular resources and their understanding that surface fish were needed to give us the next generation. It wasn't greed. It was subsistence. It was really living over a period of generations was important to them, rather than making piles and piles of money and then leaving it behind you at 80 or 90 years of age. That wasn't in their vision at all.
Yeah, definitely. And talking about discoveries and we understand how significant it can be for cultural reasons and the place of salmon in people's life and history. But in terms of scientific discovery, can you give us some examples of the latest discovery that have been done on your salmon populations in Europe?
Yeah, I think probably the most interesting discoveries have been around genetics. And that has certainly become, just in a period of maybe 15 years, 16 years, so sophisticated. And some of the techniques that Salmon at Sea program I mentioned that were first trialed during that Salmon at Sea program, they're now used on a day-to-day basis by our managers. And the importance of this individual stock complex. So we've 144 designated populations of salmon in Ireland. There's something about 250, I think, in Scotland. So now the management is around those individual populations, and genetically you can actually see that.
Wow.
And again, when we went to sea and started to see how could we identify these particular fish at sea, the geneticists came up with this fantastic profile whereby they could actually show that salmon from a particular region, maybe not from a particular river, but say, for example, salmon from the west coast of Scotland, had a completely different set of genes and makeup to the salmon from the east coast of Ireland. So by catching these little fish, these little post-smolts at sea, and doing genetic analysis, you could actually say what area they were from. And in many ways, that was as useful to us as knowing which individual river it was from. And certainly, I mean, some of the work that Patrick Martin is going to talk to you about, Patrick's been involved on the Loire. I've been involved with him for many years on the Loire. And that is such a unique population of salmon. It's probably the oldest salmon population in the world.
Wow.
And certainly you have only about maybe 400 or 500 now wild individuals going back. But that's a unique piece of genetic history going back thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, that again needs to be conserved in its own right. And I think that sort of work I find really exciting. And the young people I meet who are involved in these areas, they're so enthusiastic and they're seeing so many breakthroughs. I think that will help us greatly, particularly looking at that analogy again about the patient. I think in terms of the recovery and understanding how we can support the recovery without damaging the genetics, I think that would be a whole world ahead of where we were 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's awesome. And technically for our listeners, like listening about genetics, what does it look like when you want to study the genetic of something like salmons? You go at sea, take some salmons. How is it made to like advance the scientific discovery on genetics?
So what we did originally, and it was colleagues of mine, it was a chap called Tom Cross and another chap called Phil McGinnerty, and this would have been back maybe 20 years ago. So they started by climbing mountains. So they climbed mountains and found these tiny little baby salmon in very remote areas. And they then took a profile, what they call a baseline. So they knew that those salmon were isolated, that they were fish that had been there for the last 8,000 or 10,000 years. They would have a particular profile. And that was the hypothesis, if you like. They didn't know if this would work.
Yeah.
And they then went from river to river, and they suddenly realized that they were picking up differences in terms of the actual proteins that they were looking at in the gene. And they suddenly realized that statistically they could actually begin to separate out these rivers. And they then said, if we go further down and we start taking samples in the main stem, and they did that, and they were able to show that there was continuity. Then they went out and started to look in estuaries. Then Ken Whelan came along and said, maybe we'll be crazy enough to go out and do this at sea, because I was thinking about sticking tags in thousands and thousands of salmon and using tagged fish to try and look at where they went at sea. And it was Tom and Phil that said to me, no, that's crazy. That's old fashioned. What you should be doing is fund us to do the genetics. So we took this enormous chance and we got these big research ships that were probably about $18,000, $20,000 a day.
Wow.
And we got a loan of these ships to go out. And at a board meeting, when I was trying to get a ship from our Marine Institute, one of the board members said to me, but Ken, what happens if you don't get anything? And I had to say, I don't know, because I said, we may get nothing. So it was,
that's
the exciting part of science is that you can take that risk and you can jump into a big ocean. And some fella rings you then, as happened to me. I wasn't on the first cruise. I got this phone call. The very first time they put the net out, they got a baby salmon and a few baby sea trout.
That
And this
was a
was
win.
way off the west coast of Ireland. I said, bingo, that's it.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't believe how successful that cruise was in terms of being able to follow these fish. And we now have a really good map on the East Atlantic of what we call the smolt highway. So we know when the fish leave the rivers. We know roughly the actual currents that they follow. And most importantly, we know where they end up. So there's one area off the northwest coast of Norway called the Boring Plateau. And that's where our salmon are making for when they first go to sea.
Oh, wow.
So all of that has come in the last 10 or 15 years.
Because
and
of
that
an
really
incredible
makes it
risk.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, because you had that vision and you took that incredible risk of maybe going out at sea at high cost and getting nothing.
Nothing, yeah, exactly, yeah.
That's interesting. We need to talk about sports fishing as well. Can you tell us a little more about how it's managed in the different countries that you have in Europe?
Yes, I will, of course. So again, it tends to follow a fairly similar pattern at this stage. Certainly 30, 40 years ago, it was managed in very different ways by different countries. So maybe to contrast perhaps Scotland with other locations, Scotland has a system that really is very ancient, and it's built around ownership and around estates.
Okay.
So the big estates in Scotland tend to have control of these big rivers. And there tends to be a modest amount of fisheries that are available to sport anglers that are in clubs or that are in syndicates. So mostly you would go online and through the estate then you would book your day or book your week or whatever. And normally you would have a guide as well, which would be a gillie. But if you contrast that then with some of the other countries, for example, in the UK, the way it works is that a lot of these rivers would be run by angling clubs, and it's the same in Ireland. You would have to have a national license, but your day ticket would come from the angling club. But the management of the salmon tends to be quite similar, and they tend to be managed by the government departments rather than being managed locally in terms of the conservation goals and so on that they have to follow. And there would be agencies then like Inland Fisheries Ireland, like the Fisheries Management Group in Scotland. They would be responsible for the day-to-day upkeep of the rivers, but following the rules and regulations that come from the actual parent departments themselves.
Do you think it represents a problem that it's not locally rooted when it comes to management of these populations?
Well, strangely, at this stage, it's actually an advantage.
Good.
Certainly, because of the fact that we're dealing with really serious conservation issues, rather than having to deal with a very large number of individuals and views. If you have an actual owner, it does make a difference in terms of being able to then, if you convince the owner, take really serious action quite quickly. So that perversely, there's some advantage to that. And we just don't have the surpluses now to allow open access in terms of the fish. And that's the truth of the matter. And it's going to be that way for quite a while, I think.
Yeah, and does it evolve through time? Like from what you've seen in the 80s or the 90s compared to now, do we still manage the recreational fishing
Not really,
the same
no,
way?
to be honest. No, it didn't really. It's fairly stable in terms of the actual management regime. The rules change, obviously, in terms of how many fish are there. But the regime itself is fairly much set in stone.
You don't change a winning recipe.
You don't see that many changes.
Yeah.
But certainly, I mean, some of the countries like Germany, they're doing a great job in terms of trying to rehabilitate sections of the Rhine and so on. So there, it would be purely conservation focused. There wouldn't be any angling as such. People would be very conscious of the fact that they're in for the long haul, and they need to try all sorts of different things. But some of the accomplishments in Germany in terms of getting fish back to those rivers, even though they're fish that come from hatcheries, they're very impressive. And they're putting a very serious effort in. I think we have to give them a lot of encouragement as well, because with the advent of these new genetic techniques, you'll probably be able to refine the type of fish that we're using in the restocking program. And I certainly would be someone that would advocate a much broader view, because in some cases, you'll see biologists will react very strongly in terms of stocking and say, oh my God, we can't even think about that. It depends what your definition of stocking is, and it depends what your objectives are. And combining genetics with the new knowledge we have now in terms of the overall biological knowledge, I'd be very hopeful that we come up with techniques where we can replicate very closely the sort of selection and so on that we're seeing in the wild. And I think that gives me great hope.
Well, let's talk about hope a little more. What gives you hope, or how do you see the situations in like 10 or 20 years from now?
Well, being very honest, I think we're going to find it very difficult to actually maintain the salmon population in some of the rivers that are becoming super warm, rivers where we have low volumes of water during the summer and perhaps very, very major floods then during the winter. It's putting huge pressure on these systems. So just to give you some idea of the sort of temperature challenges that we have here in Europe, there were some data released by Inland Fisheries Ireland for 2023, and one of our major salmon rivers in Ireland is the River Moy. And some of the tributaries of the River Moy, they peaked at 29 degrees centigrade. You know, I mean, that is just completely unacceptable from a salmon or trout point of view.
Yeah.
And even our big lake systems, we did a webinar last night now looking at some aspects of our lakes. And even some of the bays in our bigger lakes, which are huge sheets of water, you're looking at maybe 20,000 hectares, 40,000 acres. Some of those bays are getting up to 20 degrees centigrade now. And they're just, again, they're very, very, very much higher than anything I would have experienced in the past. So I think in those sorts of situations, we may start to lose populations of fish. I love the idea, particularly in Canada, this idea of strongholds, because we tend to send in the fire brigade to the rivers that have a problem, rather than actually looking at the rivers that are still sustaining good populations of fish. And we need to put a big, give them a big puddle and put a big protection ring around them. Because if you're trying to reestablish stocks, let's say worst case scenario, you lose some of the smaller stocks. Your best option in terms of recovery is the nearest neighbor. And if you have a really strong population of salmon, the most important thing is to make it even stronger. Not to say, that's fine, let's go and help the one that's in danger, which you have to do as well. But I think that idea of stronghold is going to be really important to us. Overall, we're not going to lose salmon. Salmon have been around for millions of years in one form or another. They may not be in the locations we'd like them to be, but they'll certainly be around. But I think in areas such as the Arctic, where you are in Canada, and we're close to it as well, I think in those sort of cold water regimes, I think we have a great chance to be able to sustain them. But I think we probably have to think differently in terms of what we're looking to do, and to really, really think about conservation and restoration, and to stop worrying all the time about fisheries. I'm not sure they're going to exist much longer.
Yeah. Do you think we'll have the creativity and innovation to get there?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I'm always optimistic. And I certainly through my work in the university, I mean, meeting young people that are so motivated, their views are just so mature, and they've so much information to them at their fingertips. And I think if we can fire these people up and set them loose, I think they can create miracles. But I think that's what we need to be doing.
I think we couldn't get any better conclusion than that. Ken Whelan, thank you so much for spending that time with us and sharing your knowledge and your stories about Atlantic salmon populations in Europe. It was such a pleasure to listen to you and talk to you about that. Thank you so much for being here. And to our listeners, so I'll get back to the French part so our listeners who are still there can understand a little bit. But c'était Ken Whelan qui nous parlait de la situation du saumon atlantique dans les pays européens, en direct de Dublin, mais aussi sur les autres pays autour, où on fait face à des enjeux qui sont un peu similaires à ce qu'on voit chez nous au Québec. Et il y a des innovations technologiques, il y a de la collaboration, je pense que c'est la clé qui est vraiment importante, et surtout de l'espoir. Depuis les années 80-90, les défis ont changé, la science a changé, nos opportunités ont changé, et ce que Ken nous raconte, c'est que malgré tout ça, et malgré un futur qui est peut-être un peu sombre, on voit quand même qu'à force de collaboration, d'innovation et de créativité, il y a encore de la place pour l'espoir et l'optimisme pour les générations futures. Puis, on a une belle génération de futurs scientifiques ou de futurs experts qui s'en vient, selon lui, en Europe. Donc, c'est vraiment génial. C'est cool de parler à des gens comme ça de l'international puis de voir qu'on partage un peu les mêmes défis. Ken, thank you again so much for being with us today. And I hope we'll see each other soon in some collaboration work across the Atlantic Ocean.
Thank you very much, Lynn. It was a great pleasure, and the best of luck to you and your podcast. It's really important work.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, Ken.